The ending of Jujutsu Kaisen and My Hero Academia, two of the biggest manga in the last decade, has prompted discussions around many things, including the importance of endings and strain of writing weekly manga. But one of the determinations I find the most compelling is that manga of the current generation need to go back to being longer, and more specifically, having more filler in them. It's a topic that has a bit more nuance than one might think initially, and that's partially on account of there being a disconnect on what filler really means in this context. Typically, filler has been a word used in anime spaces in reference to non-canon material being created in order to give the manga time to release more content that the anime can then adapt. When I say filler in reference to both the title of this video and what people want more of, I'm not really referring to it in its conventional sense, although I do think the root of the feeling stems from its original meaning. That root mainly coming from anime with tons of filler like Naruto, showing us a lot of unique groupings and kind of wandering plots that we wouldn't normally get due to the canon story more focused style of storytelling. Now this was, and still kind of is, an absolutely despised way of going about adapting a series, but the core idea of further characterization and interactions amongst people that the author has successfully made you fall in love with is the crux of this desire for filler in manga recently. It's just a quick and dirty way of saying we want more character interactions and downtime, and well, yeah, calling basic facets of writing like that filler could be somewhat problematic in a larger context. I'm already tired of saying that word today, so I'd like to move on. Specific factors allow for people to have more than valid reasons for feeling like anime and manga, especially in recent history, would do better to have more chapters allotted to rather mundane or simple aspects of the world. God knows I feel like Horikoshi and Gege blaze through certain plot points with their manga, but I think context and a balance of expectations is really important to have when trying to talk about such a broad idea. This downtime is not a one-size-fits-all sort of term, and what that'll look like for every individual story will be different. Should the overarching societal implications of Shigaraki's defeat be explored for more than a single chapter, especially when given how important it is to the core theme of the entire manga? Sure. In fact, I'd even say that his defeat in itself could have stood to have way more meat on the bones. But that doesn't really have to come in a pre-packaged slice of lifestyle arc like the school festival. Which, by the way, if you're one of the people asking for more character interactions and complained about this, do an unpracticed backflip. The moments where things are given a bit more time to breathe and the audience is allowed to sit with their thoughts on the matter are appreciated. And while you'll be right in saying that MHA did that quite often in its first half, the latter arcs are where people start having an issue with Horikoshi's writing style. With Jujutsu Kaisen, a similar problem pops up. From chapter 1 until maybe chapter 222, the common opinion was that Gege's pacing, while fast, wasn't anything that left you wanting for more in the way of addressed character or plot points. This generous interpretation of Gege's writing style started becoming a bit soured when, instead of showing us many of the potential character interactions that unsealed Gojo could have with our newly improved characters, we got thrust into the beginning stages of Shinjuku Showdown with not much fanfare. Some people, me, are still salty about this, and those people, still me, think that the story would benefit for a breather every once in a while. Does this mean that every character should sit around and list all the things they loved about Gojo right after he died? No, and honestly, fuck every maker of straw that made that stupid retort. Me and God cooking up something special for you, buddy. Now, sure, chapters like 64 are nice and wholesome and pretty well loved universally, but moments like this, where in the midst of a battle a character is reflecting on their choices in the current events without it directly relating to strategy, are just as valid ways of fleshing out the narrative and characters, and I'd even say they're necessary to telling a good story. Many of these emotions can be implied or demonstrated throughout the course of the fight, and I welcome those implications, but there are times when you just need to let the characters comment or introspect in a very overt way. This doesn't mean that the prose have to be hand-holdy, it just means that I want to know what a character is thinking, feeling, or wanting to do at any particular moment in the story. So from this perspective, I understand people's desire for filler. Addressing rather important lore, character, or story important points is kinda something you should just do, and allowing the audience to understand the headspace of a character when the narrative isn't at direct odds with it is important. Now, I want to make clear, sometimes the narrative is in direct odds with you knowing what a character thinks. Sometimes you being in the dark is the point, but that isn't always the case, and when it isn't, I do think a story would benefit from allowing us in there. Now, that being said, some of you niggas take this point and stretch it a little too far for my liking. Like, sure, some things need to be addressed, and sure, some characters would do well to tip their hand a little bit more, but we also gotta understand that a little mystery won't kill you. Did you really need to know what Yuji's dad was doing? Like, does that add to the story, world, or themes of Jujutsu Kaisen? Yuji don't care, the world doesn't care, and to be quite frank, Gege didn't give us a reason to care, and that's not something I'm criticizing him for. Some stuff is just there for information's sake. So if you want that kind of info, wait for a data book drop. The other side of this greed coin comes from the inevitable realization that, for many battle shonen, all of the grace or patience you have been having for any given mangaka will not be paid back in turn, at least not fully. That plot point they had been subtly alluding to in the background, yeah, that was dropped in favor of a more entertaining chapter-to-chapter reading style. The character you really like, the one that's not the main focus, but pretty good and has a lot of potential, yeah, maybe the author had plans for them, but stuff comes up and they had to diminish their role in the narrative for more important thematic or overarching points. This, in a vacuum, isn't some crime against storytelling. Sometimes the shit just happens. It's just part of the nature of a weekly release series. The problem is, from the fans' perspective, their time and investment was wasted, and that blows what would normally be a small level of disappointment way out of proportion to a genuine thought that the author is some bumbling idiot with amnesia. This sort of weekly expectation buildup is why you see a lot of theory crafters be upset with endings a little bit more than people that are reading it on a surface level or not bothering to speculate on what will happen in the future. Now, I want to shoot all the theory crafters here some bail. It's understandable where your frustration comes from. God knows I feel it sometimes too, but that doesn't mean it's always justified in the doses that it can come in. Sometimes we doing a little too much. Sometimes the reaction is just a little overblown, and that's okay. But, well, on the topic of what filler does not have to be, I'll also say that downtime and filler in this context does not mean slice of life chapters. It certainly can, but it don't have to. We don't need to see characters sit around a coffee shop laughing together and saying, ha ha ha, I needed this. While the entire point of the arc is spelled out for us like we're toddlers in order to ascertain a higher level of insight for certain story elements. I hate to be that guy. Like, genuinely and truly hate to be that guy, but reading between the lines is something you have to and honestly should want to do with a series you really enjoy. Now, in order to do that in the first place, there have to be lines to read between, but just like a lot of things, it's a balance. If you want an example of a story that achieves this balance, Dandadan is actually a great and topical one. Yuki no Butatsu has found a very solid blend of the bombastic, dangerous, and serious arcs and character moments with ones that allow for the audience and characters within the narrative to really take everything in and set up for future events, arcs, and sagas. He achieves this harmony in a way that's honestly rather simple and won't work or be optimal for every story, but the formula is quite basic. Big climactic arc, followed by a mini arc or small subset of chapters where everyone reconvenes, eats food, goes to school or whatever else, and then we repeat the cycle all over again. After the Turbo Granny arc, which introduced Okarun and Momo, as well as the world of aliens and ghosts at large, we get like 4.5 chapters before the next major battle or story reveal is put into motion. And those chapters aren't meaningless just because they aren't super plot driven. Deepening and exploring the connection between our two protagonists is important, in part for the romantic aspect of the story, but also because it's useful to further endearing us to them. Like I said, this isn't possible or optimal for every manga under the sun, but it does work really well for Dandadan. Frieren is another story that fits the bill of letting the journey really play out on full display instead of focusing on spectacle, flash, or brevity. Now, in Frieren's case, it's kinda cheating considering that that's the entire point of the story, but people loved that anime as it was coming out, and I think the exploratory nature of its characters is a big reason for that. You could even take a manga like One Piece that is more conventionally battle shonen-y, and many people will attribute their love for the Straw Hat crew to moments of downtime that Oda gives for them to just be goofy pirates sailing into unknown waters and lands. Now, word on the street, or I guess word on the current is that these interactions post time skip become more limited, but considering I haven't gotten there yet, it's purely conjecture on my part. If that is the case though, that would explain some of the sourness I see for the crew post time skip that doesn't really apply where I'm at in the story. In any case, it's not like Oda has to derail the narrative to give us these moments. I also want to clarify, just because something isn't absolutely necessary to telling the story and covering plot points doesn't mean that it wouldn't aid in telling it better. Perfect example for this in my mind is the recent run of Ultimate Spider-Man. Now, I know, comic book yucky and gross or lame or whatever, but if you can find it in your heart to forgive me for this transgression against Japan, I'd love for you to hear me out. This run has been going on for 9 issues at the time of this recording that drop on a monthly basis, and while I've been thoroughly enjoying myself, I will say that the run feels very event focused, if that makes any sense. I know the run in and of itself is an event, so a sense of urgency is kinda necessary, but it feels like the amount of time that ellipses between each issue is so vast without the connection to these alternate versions of the characters and their lives growing proportionately. Now, I don't pretend to be a master in the art of comics. In fact, I know painfully little about comic books. It's kinda scary over here. But with other runs that I've read, like All-Star Superman, there was more of a day-to-day feel that seems somewhat lost here. In this instance, no plot point has really been dropped per se, but a wall of separation seems to exist for me and the ultimate versions of these characters in Spider-Man's world that I think could be bridged with more quality time dedicated to the little things. Peter and MJ's family, small busts as Spider-Man, and introspection on how being a superhero for like 6 months has impacted him. Now, to the credit of Jonathan Hickman, the writer for this series, I actually think he's accomplished this extremely well when it comes to Uncle Ben and J. Jonah Jameson's relationship, as well as Peter and Harry's. And I also trust that this will improve over time with other dynamics. It's just something that I'm noticing now and would like to comment on given its relevance to the video. Anywho, back to your regularly scheduled black and white backwards comic talk, I think it's safe to say that this desire for filler doesn't come from a bad or even totally unreasonable place. As mentioned with the series and examples given, there are many circumstances in which it would make sense for a story to extend or even just create from scratch instances that allow for thought that isn't just the logistics of a fight. Like, did you know most of Deku's internal monologue in the final battle against Shigaraki was not about how he felt, was not about speculation on Shigaraki's feelings, it was purely tactical. And from a practical standpoint, sure, that makes sense. But from a narrative enjoyment and character exploration standpoint, it is sorely disappointing. And implicitly, I think we can all acknowledge this, as, say for example, Yuji's discussion with Sukuna in chapter 265 is completely devoid of fighting, completely changes up the tone and pacing of the battle, focuses on discussion and reflection, and was still regarded as one of the best things Gege's ever put to paper, not in spite of it focusing on discussion, but because it focused on the dialogue and dynamic between the two characters. The formula is there, the understanding is there, sometimes it's just really hard to articulate. That being said, you have to be able to distinguish meaningful interactions from information that we could have gotten in a data book. Sure, not seeing Deku's dad is absolutely hilarious, but it was never given super heavy narrative weight by Horikoshi, so your expectations of that being revealed or of that being relevant should be tempered accordingly. I completely understand why many mangaka have leaned away from these really long-running series that aid in giving these more filler moments in exchange for more health and maybe more variety in their body of work. But as demonstrated with stories like Dandadan and Frieren, I think you can still be brief and flesh these moments out. Filler is something that people want for a reason, and despite there being some caveats to it, I tend to agree that this desire is a well-founded and positive one. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more anime, manga, and media analysis coming to the channel soon. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.